Okay, great. Thank you for the really nice introduction, David. So thank you everyone for being here today. It's really nice to see everyone in the same Zoom room. And today I'll be talking about machine learning for satellite imagery when labels are scarce. That's the topic that ties my thesis together. And before I get into the technical details, let me first give you guys an idea of why we're working on this. So in 2015, the UN set 17 sustainable development goals, and these are meant for all of humanity as big goals that we should all strive toward. And they include things like no poverty, gender equality, climate action, and many more. And the ones that are going to motivate the examples and the applications I'm going to show today are these two in particular. SDG 2, which is zero hunger, and then 15, which is life on land, which also means sustainable land use. And some of the smaller goals within each of these include achieving sustainable agriculture, doubling smallholder productivity, and combating land degradation. So in order to reach a goal, you first want to know where you're starting and how fast you're progressing. And measuring some of these goals on a global scale is really difficult. The traditional way that we get data about the world is usually through surveys. And here I'm showing a picture of the US Census being conducted. And surveys give you a lot of high quality data, but they also have some serious shortcomings. The first one is that they can be really expensive and they require statistical capacity to be done. For one example is that the US 2020 census cost $15.6 billion. And the UN in 2018 estimated that countries in Africa and Asia only have the data available to monitor 20% of SDG indicators. Surveys also lack spatial detail. They're reported to the UN often at the province or state level, or sometimes even national level. So you don't get any of the trends or trade-offs that might be happening locally. They also aren't updated frequently in time. They're conducted usually at most annually, often every few years, or in the case of the census, once every 10 years. And the World Bank in 2019 estimated that only 35% of sub-Saharan African countries have poverty data collected since 2015. So with this sort of very coarse spatial information and temporal information, it's very hard for us to answer questions about why some policies are successful while others are not, because the actions that are being taken are very local in both time and space. Thankfully, we live in an exciting time where we have a lot of other data sources about what's going on our planet. And you may have seen a time lapse like this showing what's going on our planet through satellite imagery. And this particular example is showing Landsat from, I think Landsat and Sentinel data from 1984 to today in one region in Brazil, where you can see very clearly that agricultural land is expanding, and that's happening at the expense of forest cover. The advantages of satellite data relative to surveys are that they are affordable, at least once you launch the satellite. The marginal cost is very low. They're globally available, and they're much more spatially detailed. So here I'm showing a nice video that the European Space Agency made showing the Sentinel-2 satellites orbiting Earth and how they revisit the same spot on Earth every 5 days. And if you're looking at one particular, let's say, crop field in India, over the course of a year, Sentinel is going to pass over once every 5 days or so, or sometimes more frequently. And you might get a time series like this. If you're looking at how green the crop field is, you can see through 2 of the growing seasons in India that the crop is getting greener, and then it gets harvested, so the greenness goes down. So you can get a lot of information about crops and a lot of other things through satellite imagery. And the UN has also made a note of this in some of its reports. So this particular Global Sustainable Development Report from 2015 laid out in a nice table the different SDGs and what satellite imagery can measure about them. And in this case, it ranges from poverty, which you can measure through nightlights, to, let's say, urban extent in cities, and all the way to oceans, vessels conducting illegal fishing. And it's also been a really exciting time to work with satellite data, because in the last 7 years, there's been this massive increase in how many satellites have been launched, which you can see in the plot on the left. The spatial resolution has gotten better and better as well over time. And I don't have a graphic to show that here, but it's become more and more accessible as well through cloud-based technologies. So we have all this raw data, and if we want to extract insights from that data automatically, we need some sort of algorithm. And in the last the same amount of time, roughly, we've had a massive improvement in machine learning algorithms, deep learning in particular, and how well they can perform classification, segmentation, all sorts of tasks on raw data or unstructured data like imagery. And on the right, I'm showing the top 1 accuracy on ImageNet classification. So that's a really famous data set in computer vision, where you have the model classify between 1,000 different classes, figuring out what's in the particular image. And you can see that in the last 10 years, the top 1 accuracy increased from about 50% to the recent number is 90%. So there's been a huge improvement. So like many fields, satellite imagery has also been influenced a lot by this development in deep learning. And we've seen convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks, generative adversarial networks, transformers, all sorts of models, architectures and algorithms applied successfully to process satellite imagery. For example, applications like scene classification, object detection, building segmentation, road segmentation, and so on. We've also seen a proliferation of data sets that are labels for satellite imagery, like the one on the left, which is called Functional Map of the World. And here we can see in very high resolution satellite imagery, the different features get labeled what's in the satellite imagery. So everything from crop fields to, fire stations to lakes and ponds and so on. So if you have a lot of labeled imagery, like what we have on the left, you can do a really good job now using deep learning to figure out what's in the image. But this is only true, again, when we have these labels. And if you peel back these data sets, oftentimes what you'll find is that the distribution of labels is very uneven throughout the world. So the map on the right is showing where the different functional map of the world images are coming from. And you'll notice that in very high income regions like Europe and the US, you have thousands of images coming from these places. But then in most of the world, including the global South, you have very few images represented. And since the applications that I've been working on involve agriculture, I want to show you what's possible when we do have labels in agriculture. And then I'll talk about what the current state of the art is in low income regions. So in the US, we do get field level labels about crop types and other data about agriculture. And so what is able to happen is the USDA every year releases this data set called the cropland data layer, where they've trained a model on these field level labels and satellite imagery to produce a crop type map at 30-meter resolution for the entire lower 48 states in the US. So I'm showing one year of those maps on the left. And then on the right, if you zoom into these maps, you can see that at 30-meter resolution, you can make out individual fields in the US. And for example, you can see corn and soybeans in Iowa. You can see cotton in Texas, and you can see in the California Central Valley all types of vegetables being grown. And once you have crop type maps, they can then be used in downstream analyses. And I've given 2 examples here. On the left is from the Utah Division of Water Resources, where CDL, the cropland data layer, is used as an input for their water-related land use data. And then on the right, I'm showing some other work out of our lab, which is showing mean maize yield. Maize is another word for corn, between 2008 and 2018. And we've also done studies to look at how different management practices are impacting yield for this very large scale observational data, instead of just being limited to looking at experimental data, which might have some external validity questions. So this is what's possible when you do have a lot of data in agricultural settings. But in low income regions, we don't have crop type maps of that scale or quality. And sometimes what we do have are global land cover maps. So I'm showing an example that's made by Copernicus. It's one of the more recent products, and it's at 100-meter resolution, available globally. And it includes cropland as one of the classes. So you can at least get what's cropland and then what's not cropland. But even for a data set like this, there's evidence to show that the accuracy in a lot of countries in the global south is still low. So this is a work out of the University of Maryland, where they were doing rapid response crop maps in Togo, in this case, to help the government direct COVID aid. And what they're showing is their model in the middle column, and then the Copernicus map on the right. And they labeled a bunch of their own satellite imagery in order to produce those maps in the middle. And what they found was that Copernicus is actually very different from what the satellite imagery looks like and what their model is predicting. So even though it appears that we have global maps in some cases, the quality is, again, very uneven across the world. On the crop type map side, they're even more rare. That's an even more difficult problem than cropland. And for the most part, the crop type maps that exist out there are localized, low in accuracy, and or coarse in resolution. But I want to mention also that major progress is being made in this area. And this is another paper out of our lab that Jin led, using Sentinel to map smallholder maize in Kenya and Tanzania. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but also progress is being made. So the outline for the rest of the talk is organized into two sections as potential solutions to this label scarcity problem. The first set of solutions is to create methods that work well in settings with fewer labels. And the second set of solutions is to find alternate sources of labels. In the first category, I'm going to talk about clustering on Fourier features, so trying unsupervised learning when you don't have any labels. Then I'm going to talk about transferring knowledge across the world with meta-learning. And then finally, the project I'll conclude with is mapping crop types in India using crowdsourced data. Okay, so the first part is trying to find a feature space where you can successfully do unsupervised learning without any labels. So to describe what we're going to try to do here, we're assuming, again, that there are 0 labels available in the region that we are interested in. And we don't have any data on time series with an associated crop type label. So I'm showing you here what is, like, let's say, the underlying average corn and average soybean greenness curves across the course of a year. And in this case, the example I'm giving for corn and soybean is relevant to the US. And this is actually the sort of pattern that we see in the US. Corn tends to be sown and harvested earlier than soybean, and it's also tends to be not quite as green as soybean. But we don't actually have this knowledge a priori. What we do have are just a bunch of satellite time series. We also have crop area statistics, such as of Iowa cropland, 60% is growing corn and 40% is growing soybeans. We also are going to assume that we know where cropland is, even though I did just talk about how a lot of global cropland products are not super high accuracy in low income regions. We're going to assume that this problem is definitely further along and that we can eventually get these maps. So we're going to try to get a transformation of these time series such that the data points clustered by crop type. And then once we run a clustering algorithm to find the clusters, we're going to use this crop aggregated crop statistic to label the clusters. So for example, if I recover these two clusters after transforming the satellite time series, and then I see that one of the clusters is 50% larger than the other one, then I can use this information about corn and soybeans to say, okay, I'm going to say the larger cluster is corn and the smaller one is soybeans. And then we're going to see how this entire pipeline performs. And to evaluate this method, we're going to test it in the US Corn Belt, even though eventually we want to see if it works in smallholder systems. We first want to develop the method in a place where we have a lot of ground truth. And that's true in the Corn Belt. So I'm going to show you exactly how we extract the features and the performance there. So this is a real time series from a particular crop field in Minnesota. And over the course of a year, you can see GCVI on the y-axis here is, you can think of it as a measure of greenness again. So we have some raw time series, but this is from Landsat, so it's at 30-meter resolution. And then we're going to fit a curve to it. And that curve is going to be a regression with a Fourier basis, which I'm showing here in this equation. More concretely, I'm going to regress GCVI on a bunch of cosines and sines. And here I've fit this curve with omega, the hyperparameter, equal to 1.5. And then the regression coefficients that I get out of this, I'm going to use to do the clustering. And it turns out that the clusters that we get out of these features do correspond in a lot of cases to crop types. We also run this across the entire Corn Belt for 7 years, and I'm showing here what the features look like visualized in a false color space for one of the years. So you can see there's definitely some variation both by crop type and by where you are in the Corn Belt. So if we run this clustering, we tried 2 different clustering algorithms. One is called k-means and one is called a Gaussian mixture model. And we also run a supervised oracle, which I've labeled here as the random forest model, which is a very commonly used supervised model in remote sensing. And what the oracle is meant to show is how difficult it is to classify crops in that particular region, just if you had all of the data that you could possibly need at your disposal. So what you see is that in states like Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, and Nebraska, and in this particular year, Minnesota as well, the clustering algorithms are able to do a good job recovering the original crop types without any labels at all. But there are some states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where clustering is not working well. And in general, the Gaussian mixture model is also doing better than k-means. So we're trying to figure out why clustering works in some places and why it doesn't work in other places. And what we found is we can explain a lot of this variance with the entropy of the underlying crop distribution. So what I'm showing here on the left plot is the entropy, which is a measure of how orderly the crop type distribution is. And then I'm showing on the y-axis the clustering accuracy. And you can see the R² between these 2 values is 0.6. And to give you a more concrete idea of what entropy means, in the middle panel, I'm showing two counties in the Corn Belt, and the top one has high entropy, which means there's a lot of different crop types. And then the bottom one has a very low entropy. So there's only basically 2 crop types that you're trying to cluster and recover, corn and soybeans. So the moral of the story here is that when you only have corn and soybeans or a very simple cropping system, clustering can often do a very good job recovering those clusters. But if you have, let's say, in this case, 7 or 8 crops to recover, then the clustering part of the pipeline is going to have a really hard time picking up the correct clusters. It's not actually the cluster crop type assignment step that's failing, but it's just the clustering step that's not working. So the takeaways here would be that this type of unsupervised algorithm can work when only a few crops dominate the system. But since the US is already a relatively low entropy crop system, there's a lot of corn and soybeans, at least in the Midwest. then it's not very likely that this sort of purely unsupervised algorithm is going to work well in smallholder systems. Okay, so I just talked about the case where we assume we have 0 labeled data. And now I'm going to relax that a little bit and talk about the case where we do have access to some labels. So that second project is transferring knowledge between regions using meta-learning. And it's motivated by the fact that even though we don't have a lot of labels in low-income regions, we do have a lot of labels in high-income regions, which we just saw in the US. So I'm going to talk about using meta-learning for land cover classification now instead of crop type classification. And you'll notice in these example images from Brazil, Poland, Mali, and Angola that cropland all over the world definitely looks different, but it also shares certain similarities. So crop fields tend to all be kind of rectangular in shape. So the question is, if we had data about cropland in Brazil and Poland and Mali, can we somehow use that information to do better on cropland classification or segmentation in Angola? Now you might think, okay, like one thing we can try is we can just train a model where we do have data and then directly apply that model where we don't have data or we have fewer data. Excuse me. And one reason that often fails is that you have distributional shifts. And I'll show you with these diagrams what that can do to your model. So let's say in a very simplified example where you just have 2 features and you're classifying crop versus not crop in Brazil, that these 2 clusters are totally separable and you train a model to distinguish between them and you're super happy because you have 100% accuracy. And then you go to Angola and you take your model with you and you decide to just apply it without any changes. And what can happen is that because the climate and many other things are different in Angola, you have distributional shift. So now your model from Brazil is actually performing really badly. So instead of just directly applying the model, we can try to do something more intelligent. And I'll explain what that algorithm is by building up to it from some more common things that people do in machine learning. So the most basic thing you can do if you wanted to distinguish cropland from not cropland in Angola is you could just train a model from scratch. And here I'm showing in the points that are circled in black, those are the test points, the holdout set that you don't train the model on, but you use them to evaluate your model. So let's say we train on Angola and then we evaluate using some subset of these very few data points that you have. And here you're not going to be using any of the data that you have access to in Brazil and other places. So if you did want to make use of that data, what you can do is you can pre-train everywhere you have data, including Angola. So you just throw all your data together, you train your model, and then you fine-tune that model on Angola, which is the region that you actually care the most about doing well in. So this is very commonly done. People often pre-train for image tasks on ImageNet and then fine-tune on whatever task they actually care about. An even more sophisticated way of going about transferring knowledge is you can, instead of just throwing all your data into one soup and then training your model, you can mimic the setting that you would encounter in Angola and then try to train a model or find a way for the model to do well in that setting. So even though we have, let's say, tons of data in Brazil and Poland and Mali, we can subsample smaller tasks from these regions where we limit the amount of data that we have access to. And then we try to, by observing how the model performs on these small tasks from each of these regions, try to find a way to improve the model so that it is able to adapt with just a few examples to do better. So just a quick note that the work in applying meta-learning to remote sensing data is still super new, and there's not a lot that's been done in this space, but I just put 2 papers here that are concurrent with some of the work that I'm mentioning in this part of the presentation. So the way that I describe meta-learning in the last slide is pretty abstract. And the particular algorithm that we're going to be using is called model agnostic meta learning, and that was introduced by Finn and others in 2017. And this animation shows what this particular meta learning algorithm that we're using actually does. And so there's the pseudocode on the left if you're familiar with reading such things, but I'll try to describe what it's doing more in English. So if you look at the animation, what model agnostic meta learning is doing, and by the way, it's called model agnostic because it can be applied to any model that can be trained using some sort of gradient descent type algorithm. And what MAML's doing is it's trying to find an initialization, which is denoted using theta in this animation, that can quickly adapt to a new task using just a few examples. And it does that. So when it updates, it samples data from these tasks, which are denoted in gray. And the data is first sampled in the blue points that are shown in the animation. And the first set of points that are sampled are what are called the support set in meta learning. And so the support set is going to help the model adapt from the initialization theta into specific parameters, which are denoted as phi 1, 2, and 3 for the different tasks, 1, 2, and 3. And then so it's going to adapt using the support set, and then it's going to then evaluate how that model is performing using another subsample of new blue points, which are called the query set. And then that query set is going to be used to update the parameters theta so that the next time you use theta to adapt to your tasks, it's going to do better than before. So there are second order gradients being computed in MAML. And to test MAML, we use a whole bunch of different satellite data sets. I'm going to describe 2 out of the 3 experiments that we did. The first experiment is on MODIS time series, and we're going to try to do land cover classification on a global scale, where we train the model on data from everywhere except Africa, and then we're going to test it in Africa. And these are time series that are an 8-day average at 250 meter resolution from the MODIS Terra surface reflectance product. And the labels in this case are coming also from a MODIS direct product called the Terra Aqua combined land cover product. The second set of experiments I'm going to show is the SEN12MS image classification data set. So this one is also global in scale. And in this case, we're not stratifying by continent, but we are sampling a meta test set from around the world. And this data set, SEN12MS, is multispectral. It's coming from the Sentinel-2 satellite, which is at 10 meter resolution. And again, the labels that we have are the MODIS land cover product, which I should maybe mention is also a machine learning derived product. So one caveat is that it may also not be doing as well in a place like Africa that's lower income. And lastly, we ran experiments on a very high resolution data set called Deep Globe. And this is RGB imagery at 0.5 meter resolution. And these labels, instead of being machine generated, were completely human generated. And this is a segmentation task, which means that every single pixel in the image is labeled. So I'll describe SEN12MS and Deep Globe and show you the results for those two. So in SEN12MS, the definition of a task is going to be a 2-way K-shot classification. And what that means in English is that we are going to figure out which of 2 groups a new image belongs to after seeing just K examples of each group. So here I'm showing for the support set, we would sample 2 classes at random. So in this case, we have forest and cropland. And then we also are having 2 shots here. So sample 1 and sample 2 are the 2 examples that you would show the model from each class before asking it to then classify a new unseen sample into either forest or cropland. So the support set is going to be used in each task to adapt the model. And then we're going to sample from the query set, again, some forest and cropland And then we're going to see how the model performs after adaptation on the query set. And we're going to use that to update the model initialization. So when we do this, what we find is that the mammal trained model outperforms the two baselines, which are what I showed early on in the section, pre-training or randomly initializing a model and training from scratch in each region. So totally independent. There's no sharing of information across regions for that randomly initialized model. And we see that the mammal trained model, which is shown in orange here, adjusts to new distributions in a single example, and then it's able to outperform the baselines as long as you show it at least one example. If you don't show it any examples, it's not doing well, but that is because we don't train the model to do well on the 0-shot case. And pre-trained, you can see, is doing well in 0-shot, which makes sense because it's using the information that it's learned from all the other regions. On Deep Globe, what we're asking the model to do is to perform segmentation. And the Deep Globe dataset is comprised of these very large over 2000 by 2000 pixel images, which are fully densely labeled by humans. And each tile is split into a support set and a query set. And for a particular task, we're going to sample at least one shot, so one very small patch of the Deep Globe image. We're going to show it to the model. We're going to show the RGB image and the human label. And then we're going to ask the model to segment the rest of the image that's in the query set. So from seeing a very small part of the image, we're going to ask the model to do something pretty difficult, which is segment half of the image that it hasn't seen before. And let me just mention that each task can be up to 6 ways because this data set contains 6 land cover classes, which include agriculture, rangeland, water, urban, barren, and I think there's a 6th one as well. So when we run these experiments, what we find again is that mammals able to do better than pre-training and a model that's initialized randomly. And I think the results in the right images are interesting because you can get a sense of what each model is actually doing when it sees a small patch of an image and has to extrapolate to the query set in the image. So the query set is everything that's not grayed out in the right columns of the image. So I'm showing the RGB image with the patch highlighted, circled in red that the model gets to see. And then I'm showing the human label, which is the ground truth. And I'm showing the results from the model trained using mammal versus pre-trained versus randomly initialized and trained from scratch. And so you can see that the mammal model, if it sees a patch of the image, it's able to combine what it knows previously from seeing the rest of the data set with what it sees in that very small patch in the image. So you can see that there is no cyan class, which in this case is urban area. There's no urban area in the patch that the image sees, but mammal is still able to predict urban area because it's seen it before during training time. The pre-trained model can also do this, and I think it's doing a pretty good job of picking out the urban areas because urban is a pretty distinct class that looks relatively similar across the data set. But the pre-trained model also has a strong bias in favor of predicting cropland because that is the most dominant class in the data set. In contrast, the randomly initialized class, basically what it seems to do is just predict the most represented class in the single patch that you're showing it. In the bottom row, we also see that mammal is also not perfect. In this particular bottom example, it's seeing a patch that has a lot of the pink class in it, which is rangeland, and it has less urban area. So as a result, mammal's predicting more rangeland than urban area. So there's still room for improvement. And you can see that the patch that the model gets to see is pretty influential in what it's actually predicting. Okay, so that concludes part 2 of the project, my projects. And then I'll talk about part 3, which is mapping crop types in India with crowdsourced labels, which approaches this problem of label scarcity from a different perspective, which is trying to get more data. So I talked early on in the presentation about how the main strategy for collecting data right now is to conduct field surveys. And in this, you're limited by the amount of people and resources that you have. But another way to collect labels, which we often see in computer vision, is through crowdsourcing. So here in this model, you have a bunch of different people, potentially millions of people, who are sending you the data that you're interested in. And so then the question becomes, why would they do that? What is the motivation for them to do this? And in our case, for agricultural data, the answer is that we can provide some information back to the farmers about their crops. And so there's this really awesome app called Plantix that we partnered with. And Plantix is an app that allows farmers to take a picture of their plant, and then they will run that image, that smartphone image, through their models, and then return information on what disease or nutrient deficiency might be ailing that plant. So through this process, since the smartphone has a GPS and the photo becomes geotagged, and when Plantix is classifying the crop disease or nutrient deficiency, it also goes through the intermediate step of figuring out the crop type. We therefore have crop types that are geotagged, which allows us to use satellite imagery to then try to create a wall-to-wall map of crop types. So we were working with Plantix data over the course of 2 years, and that yielded nearly 2 million Plantix submissions, which in the world of crop type mapping is a huge data set. And here I'm showing for those 2 million submissions where they're coming from. And for the most part, at least in Plantix's early days, most of that data came from 2 states in Southeast India, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And I'm showing for the 4 main crops, or the 4 crops that are most highly represented in the Plantix dataset, and those are rice, cotton, pepper, and peanut, and I'm showing where in the 2 states they're coming from. So to create a crop type map, I'm going to simplify the problem and just focus on mapping the major crops, in this case, rice and cotton, and I'm only gonna try to map Kharif crops, and Kharif refers to the monsoon season, because in India, in this region, there can be up to 3 growing seasons. So I'm just gonna focus on the longest one. So I mentioned how there's the advantage of huge volume when we have crowdsourced data, but the challenge when working with crowdsourced data is that you also have a lot of noise. For example, GPS location is not perfect, and we actually get a measure of GPS accuracy from the Android platform. And we can see that in some cases, it can be the precision in this GPS can actually be as high as 1,000 or a kilometer or worse. And in a smallholder system where the fields are 2 hectares or oftentimes much smaller than 2 hectares, something like a 1 kilometer accuracy obviously is going to get us super far out of the field that the crop type is actually coming from. So what we do is we throw out all of the submissions with GPS location that's worse than 50 meters. Another thing that we observed a lot of, even after removing for this GPS location imperfection, is that sometimes farmers will stand outside of their fields or in an urban area when they're submitting data about their crops. So some of the reasons for this might include that they don't have good internet connection when they're in their field, so they go home or they go somewhere with better internet connection, which is often in an urban area, to take a picture and then submit it. And they might also take pictures from next to their crop field because they don't want to step on their crops, or they don't need to in order to take a picture. So in order to filter out these irrelevant submissions, I'll talk about this in more detail in the next slide, but we're also going to use deep learning to do that. Another source of noise is that the crop type classifier on the Plantix side also makes mistakes. And in particular for crop types like gram, you can see that the accuracy can be as low as about 0.5. So I mentioned that we're going to focus on classifying cotton and rice. And for those two crop types, the accuracy is pretty good. So we're not going to worry too much about this source of noise. And lastly, this isn't a source of noise so much as it is a source of bias. There can be these super users that we observe submitting tons and tons of submissions, whereas most users will try the app more like a few times, maybe a few times a year. And so to make sure that these super users are not influencing where we're trying to do well with our classification, we just do a more geographically representative resampling so that our training set and our test set more closely align with just are more representative of our study region as a whole. So I mentioned the second problem that we had to deal with, which is farmers not being inside their field, or at least the GPS location that's returned not being inside a field. So in order to deal with this problem, we're going to use very high resolution satellite imagery, and we're going to use a deep learning model to throw out the irrelevant submissions. So these very high resolution satellite images are at 0.3 meter resolution, and they're going to come from Digital Globe. We ourselves labeled about 1,000 images for whether this red box in the center is falling inside a field, or more than half inside a field, less than half, or just completely not in a field. And then with these labels and images, we're also going to draw this Sentinel-2 footprint in the center to mark like what a 10-meter pixel would look like. And we're going to train a ResNet-18, which is a type of neural network, to classify automatically whether the Sentinel footprint is coming from inside a field. And we were able to get almost 90% accuracy differentiating between more than half and less than half in a field. So that was good enough for us to move on to the next step, which is classifying satellite time series with a neural network. And the satellite time series that we're going to use here comes from Sentinel again. And for each submission, we're going to extract the time series over the course of a year. And we also have the corresponding crop type label from Plantix. We then run this time series through a one-dimensional convolutional neural network, a pretty shallow one. And then we use the Plantix crop type labels to supervise that model. When we do this, we get a rice and cotton map that achieves 76% accuracy. And we can compare this performance to if you just guessed the majority class, which in our data set is rice. If we did that, the accuracy would be 39%. So we're definitely learning something that's not just random guessing, but there's still also room for improvement. And a lot of that could be also in the fact that the validation set still has some noise in it, because even though we throw out submissions that don't fall inside a field, we don't have a guarantee that the field that the submissions do fall into was the actual corresponding field. If you look at performance by crop type, you'll notice also that for rice in particular, our model is doing particularly well. So the accuracy and precision and recall are all 85 to 90%. We also observed that if we add noise into our training set and our validation set, basically if you, here I'm degrading the quality of the training set and validation set by adding back some of the submissions that are not coming from inside a field that I said I threw out earlier. But for this experiment, I'm adding them back in. And if you do that to the training set, you'll notice that that doesn't really degrade performance on the validation set. But if you add them to the validation set, then obviously the validation accuracy is going to go down because your validation set quality is becoming much worse. So the lesson here was you don't need a super clean training set, but you do need a very clean validation set to assess how you're doing. Finally, we use Google Earth Engine to scale up our model to the entire 2 states in India. And I'm showing the results of that scaling up on the right. And then if you zoom in, you can see some properties of the map, like a lot of times along rivers where there's water, you will see a lot of rice being grown, or at least the model predicting rice. And that's not, the feature of being near water is not something that we ever taught the model, So I think the results look promising. Okay, so the takeaways from the entire body of work that I just outlined include that if we view our planet as a data set generating process, we can use meta learning to decrease the number of labels that we need to perform well in new regions. As I just mentioned, when looking for new sources of training data, we don't need those sources to be devoid of noise in order to supervise a model to high performance, but we do need some high quality validation data in order to understand how well we're doing. And so I would conclude that we should invest in technologies to acquire weak or crowdsourced labels because they can achieve scale. And in this case in Plantix, we had 2 million submissions at much lower cost than traditional field survey based approaches. Okay, so that concludes the technical portion of my talk. And I'm going to move on to the acknowledgements, and then I can take questions all together at the very end.